everybody, it's JJ Kitchen from jaysbeard.com. I hope you're doing well today. We are doing something a little bit different from our usual videos. Hopefully we'll be able to do this more frequently. This is sort of a story time about my experiences with Crohn's disease. Now, I've suffered from Crohn's disease for more than 50 years. I'm in my mid to late 60s. I'm 67 years old. When I was about 12 years old, I woke up one night with this incredibly painful pain in my abdomen. I didn't know what it was. I was in so much pain, I was crying and screaming, and my parents took me to the hospital, and they couldn't find out what it was. First, they thought my appendix was having problems, but it turned out nothing. From that point forward, things were sort of quiet, but I was noticing that I was having a little bit more problems with my belly and a runny tummy, so to speak. I do have a very distinct memory when I was about 13, my dear friend Scott's dad, his RV was one of the first sort of touring bus kind of RVs. They were very new at the time, and this was really kind of special. So I do remember taking a trip with Scott and his family up to northern Michigan. I grew up in a place called Grand Rapids, Michigan. So we went to northern Michigan, and all I remember having to use that chemical toilet way more than I should have at that age. It has stuck with me for more than 50 years, those experiences or that experience. But be that as it may, I moved into my teenage years, and when I was about 14, I got really, really sick. I was passing a lot of blood and mucus and really gross stuff, which we won't get into too much here, but I ended up being taken to a hospital in Chicago. My father was a physician, and they knew some doctor, Dr. Theron Randolph. If you Google him, he's well known because he was kind of the first doctor who proposed the crazy idea that environmental factors may affect your health. This is sort of like, pollution impacts your asthma. People weren't believing it. Plastics, forever plastics. Nobody knew what they were talking about. He was kind of a trailblazer, but people thought he was crazy because the conventional wisdom at the time was, no, what are you talking about? In any event, when I went to his clinic, so to speak, he operated out of a hospital in Chicago called Henrotin Hospital. And what the protocol was, the patient would be fed mineral water for 4 straight days. That's all you get: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, mineral water. So it flushes your whole system out. In theory, also makes you highly suggestive to watching food commercials on television. I mean, for a long time, all I wanted to do was become a chef because I watched these food commercials and I would get insanely hungry and kind of triggered, The power of suggestion and triggering. I mean, I really wanted to be the Galloping Gourmet. Now, in the early 70s, there was this guy on TV called the Galloping Gourmet. He and Julia Child kind of created the first cooking shows that were out there. Being deprived of food and just living on water can really create situations where you get triggered by either seeing or smelling food. After the 4 days, they would serve you 1 food per meal. For instance, you would get 4 lobster tails, but they wouldn't be like all done up, grilled, or anything like that. They would be steamed. You wouldn't be getting a little cup of butter. You would just eat the steamed lobster tails, all 4 of them. Now, what you had to do, you had to take your temperature, I should say you had to take your pulse, like such, count it off for a full minute, eat your meal, and then you do the same thing 20, 40, and 60 minutes after you eat. And you keep a diary, and you note any kind of funky reactions you may have along the way. At the end of 3 weeks plus of doing this, they come up with a diet, what you're sensitive to, what you shouldn't eat, so on and so forth. The other caveat with this diet was you were not supposed to repeat the same food or food group within 4 days. So if I eat something like, let's say, if I have steak on Monday, I can't have beef at least until Thursday. So when you're a teenage boy, this makes menu planning for your mother very, very difficult. So you couldn't come home every day and have a peanut butter sandwich. That wasn't happening. You have peanuts one day, you're done for the next 4 days. I ate some of the most exotic foods. In Chicago, there was a butcher called Zimmer's, C-Z-I-M-M-E-R, and they had all kinds of wildlife. I do remember my mother cooking bear stew. We had whale at one point, any kind of game animal you can imagine. My folks went so far as to order elk and caribou from a company out in Alaska that jarred this meat up. And it was really, the elk and the caribou was so gamey smelling. You'd open the cans and it was really like overpowering. They also, I do remember ordering cases and cases of salmon from a company called Briggs Way. The Briggs Way salmon cannery was located in a super remote part of Alaska. It was only accessible by plane or by water, meaning boat, canoe, whatever. It's in a town, or was, it's no longer in existence, but it was in a town called Ugashik, Alaska. And that stuff got me through college, I gotta say. The reason that my parents bought this salmon and caribou and whatnot from this place is because according to Dr. Randolph, it was like one of the most unpolluted places on the planet. Now, he also tried to convince my parents to move to Sequim, Washington, which ironically enough, I live in Washington now, almost 50 years later, and very close to Sequim, which is up on the Olympic Peninsula. But again, he wanted my folks to live there because it was the most, in his mind's eye, unpolluted part of this country, certainly. After I got out of the hospital in Chicago, I went back home. I was doing my normal day-to-day whatever, going to school, doing my thing, so on and so forth. And then about 2 years later, when I was about 16, I had a horrible, horrible Crohn's flare. I ended up, over the course of a couple of months, I lost about 1/4 of my blood through internal bleeding, and I was a mess. And I wasn't telling anybody because at that age, you don't want people poking around your butt. You just don't. It wasn't for me, so I was going to suck it up and get through this shit, literally. Well, it didn't work like that. My parents took me to see a physician in town where I lived. But bottom line, what he wanted to do was inject cortisone right into my butt. I mean, no pills, just right in there. This doctor didn't want to just give me one shot in the ass. He wanted multiple injections, and I was like, I personally was not feeling it. And I don't think my Dad was either, because we went back to Chicago, went back to Dr. Randolph for 3 more weeks, actually 4 more weeks of the food elimination diet. I wasn't getting any better. My belly was a little bit calmer because there was less things in it, but I wasn't getting any better. They transferred me to Billings Hospital, which, if you don't know, is the University of Chicago hospital. I was treated by a doctor there, Dr. Kirshner, who was an amazing person. I ended up getting a blood transfusion. They put me on prednisone, azulfidine, Lomodal to control my peristalsis, all kinds of things. Now, the good thing about being in the University of Chicago hospital, it was on the south side of Chicago, and that's where I actually learned how to love eating grits, as well as developed a taste for music, or developed a deeper appreciation for music. This was in the early 70s when progressive rock radio was huge. That's what dominated the airwaves. And they didn't have cable TV like they do now. Trust me, basically the only thing I watched was the Flintstones, and I got so sick of that, I tell you. The Flintstones and Gilligan's Island while I was in the hospital. But my parents had bought me this combination television radio tuner, and the TV was about a 5-inch screen, and it popped down. You press it and it would pop up in this sort of box. I believe it was made by Panasonic. And that kept me busy. Also, I did a lot of jigsaw puzzles, but most of all, I listened to a lot of progressive rock and blues music while I was in the hospital in Chicago. I was discharged that Christmas. I got home. I missed 2 months of school. I got a couple of incompletes, which were never made up. And I started living my life again. However, I was on all these medications. Now, during the course of my high school years, my parents had me on all kinds of drugs because the doctors really didn't know what the deal was with Crohn's disease. They had me on phenobarbital to calm me down. I was on Valium. One of the meds that they gave me was something called paregoric, which is basically an opium-based medication. It tastes horrible. They gave it to me orally. If you take it rectally in a suppository form, you will be stoned for days. I was on all kinds of things to kind of chill me out. Didn't really work. made me feel better, particularly the downers. I would sleep really well, but it really wasn't very helpful. The bottom line was I was on prednisone for such a long time that I developed a problem in my back and ended up having some discs removed when I was like 16. All kinds of complications and ramifications of the medication that they give you for Crohn's, at least back in the day. This is in the early 70s. I also took a lot of Tylenol 3s. When I lived in New York, that was sort of my go-to. If I was going out at night, I'd pop 2 Tylenol 3s because the codeine would slow down the peristalsis and I wouldn't have to worry about having to hit the head when I was on my date or out at a club or wherever. One of the mental stressors of having Crohn's or colitis or any disease like this is the social embarrassment that you may or may not suffer due to having to use the bathroom all the time. You know, you always got to dash off and take a poop or whatever, and it's really once or twice is cool, but if you're doing it throughout the day or the evening or the vacation, whatever it may be, it gets to be a little bit wearing, and a lot of partners can't deal with that. It's too icky. Now, they didn't know then, and they still don't know what causes Crohn's. They do believe it's a combination of environmental, genetic, and unknown factors. Some people theorize that it's an abnormal immune system reaction to bacteria in your gut. I'm imagining they're getting closer to figuring it out, but they're treating it now with these biologics, which compromises your immune system. When I was coming up, you had prednisone, or if you weren't on prednisone, but you had like a flare going on, you would use these things called court enemas, which were cortisone enemas. I do remember before I would go to work in the morning, I would work as a busboy dishwasher, I would do the court enema, and then I would lay on an inclined bench for 30 minutes so the medicine would go down my colon or up my colon, whichever. And I used those court enemas on and off for 30 years. Not the greatest thing when you're going out with someone. Excuse me, I have to squeeze this in my bum. You know what I mean? So now when you're going through Crohn's disease, certainly in the beginning when you're trying to figure things out, does this affect it? Does that affect it? You know, and if you're in a flare, you can have real urgency, which basically means you got to take a poop like now. And that can lead to some embarrassing situations and consequences. We won't detail them, but trust me, it is a stressor. You know, if you shit your pants, it fucks your head up. It fucks your head up for the whole day. I'm just saying. As I went through my college years, I was relatively quiescent because I was on a lot of medication, particularly zolpidem. I would have the occasional flare. I had to see a doctor pretty regularly when I was in school. I had to watch what I ate at the cafeteria, and I would bring a lot of food out to school with me from Michigan. When I would come back from breaks, I would have cases of salmon in cans. I would get organic peanut butter. I didn't know where to source it in Boston, silly enough. But I do remember bringing a box from the airport with peanut butter that was, you know, with the oil separated, and there were like oil stains all over the box. I used to live on peanut butter sandwiches. I made it through college in Boston. I moved to New York City, went to law school, got a job, kept doing my thing, ended up getting married. Meanwhile, I'm still dealing with the Crohn's in various ways. I abused my body. I'm not going to lie. I used to drink a lot. I used to do a lot of cocaine in the 90s in New York City, the crazy go-go 90s. That stuff ate holes in the lining of my colon. I actually had a hemorrhage and was bleeding out on my bathroom floor before my wife found me one day. And I would have all kinds of urgency. I do remember traveling to Europe with a friend of mine, and she was like, what's going on? Because I would have to hit the head frequently. It is definitely a lifestyle modifier. You've seen those commercials on TV where people are like sitting at their desk and they're on a toilet kind of a thing. Well, it's sort of like that. You just don't know when. You don't know how you're going to feel. One day you may have plans, and then your stomach, when I say stomach, I mean that in a generic sense, your gut is saying, I don't know if you should go right now because I feel something that's going to happen. And it's all connected. Your brain and your belly are all connected. In the 90s, I was also going through some very stressful things professionally and personally, which continued into the early aughts, which did not help because stress is a huge contributor to Crohn's flares. There are lots of different diets. The most prominent one is the specific carbohydrate diet. The specific carbohydrate diet was developed by a pediatrician, I believe in the 1920s, for celiac disease. Now, Elaine Gottschall had a daughter who suffered from inflammatory bowel disease, and she checked out this specific carbohydrate diet, put her child on it, and it really mitigated most, if not all, of her symptoms. I have a dear friend of mine, Angela Bacca, who's a writer and journalist who lives down in California. She's been on this diet for at least 5 years, and it's done her wonders. The problem with me, it's super, super restrictive. It's basically a grain-free diet. And check out the things that you can't eat that I posted here, just so you know what it can take to really live a so-called normal life without medication with Crohn's. Now, this is very extreme, and it's not for everybody, and it doesn't work for everybody. Ms. Gottschall wrote a book called Breaking the Vicious Cycle. I recommend that you check it out if you are curious at all about this diet. And there are a lot of websites and support groups for people who follow this diet. So check it out. So shortly after I arrived in Seattle in late 2015, I finally was able to see my doctor at the University of Washington. And once I actually was able to see her, they did a colonoscopy. The problem with the colonoscopy was my colon had so many strictures and such scar tissue, it had narrowed to the width of a pencil, which was a problem. Now, why is that a problem, you might say? Well, it's a problem because I could never completely void whatever was in my colon. In other words, I had to constantly get the urge to take a number 2. By the time they actually went in and cut me, which is about 4 months later, I was defecating up to 50 times a day. Almost uncontrollable. It was really, really horrible. On the edge of disaster, shall we say. Not to mention, every time you go to the toilet and poop, it can be very, very tiring, and not to mention dehydrating and just draining. So I was exhausted, lost a lot of weight. So a mutual decision was made based on doctor's advice that I had to proceed and get the colectomy. My life with invasive procedures for ulcerative colitis / Crohn's disease. Primarily upper and lower GI x-ray series, which require barium. If it's doing lower, you need a barium enema. If it's doing upper, you have to drink the barium. I must have done that probably a dozen times in my life. For a young person, it's not a lot of fun. Very stressful. Not only that, as I got older, I would have to do a colonoscopy every year, okay, which requires you drinking Go Lightly, which is a laxative, and cleaning out your colon and then going in, and they put you under, and then they go put a camera in your colon and check out what's going on. The best thing about the colonoscopies was the good drugs they would give you. That only came later. When I first started getting colonoscopies in New York City, you weren't totally unconscious. You were aware of what was going on, but you were doped up. So you always had to have someone pick you up at the doctor's office when you were done to get you home. Other than the anesthesia, the best part of the procedure was when it was done, I would go out with someone, whether it would be a friend, a girlfriend, my wife, whomever. We would go out to eat at Barney's, which was about 3 blocks south of my doctor's office in Upper Manhattan. And Barney's had a restaurant called Fred's, which was awesome. And I would break my fast there. So that was an annual occurrence for me up until about age 60. So if not annual, certainly semi-annually. And that was, that definitely is something that impacts on you. You can't get away from it. People now, even when they're supposed to get them over 50, they don't want to do it because of the prep. Well, if you're a Crohn's or a colitis patient, you're very familiar with this because they need to monitor what's going on in there, take biopsies, and make sure you're not developing any cancer tissue. So those kind of testing and diagnostic procedures are always a constant throughout your Crohn's journey. And they decided I need a colectomy. Colectomy. Oh my fucking God. They're going to cut a hole in me and they're going to make me shit in a bag. Oh my God. How long am I going to have to live with that for? We determined that I really didn't have a choice. So the decision was made to go forward. They did the colectomy. They gave me a bag. I won't go into the details, but shitting into a bag that's attached to your abdomen by sticky tape is really not good for your mental health. It really messes with your head, as you can probably imagine. Now, fortunately, there was enough good tissue, and my post-operation care was I was eating a ton of cannabis butter and oil in my food, which whether or not it healed me more quickly or better, I can't really say. However, it certainly made me deal with the pain in a much easier way. Thank goodness, 6 months later, they were able to reattach me, close up the stoma, and I do not have a bag anymore. So we are very thankful for that. However, they did put me on biologics. They put me on something called Humira, which I'm sure you've seen commercials for. I developed a problem with the Humira after about 3 years of using it, getting all kinds of weird skin rashes and skin lesions. So I unilaterally stopped injecting myself with the Humira. Humira is an injection the patient self-administers every 2 weeks. Now, I took myself off of that in January of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, because of these weird rashes and whatnot, and I felt better, I felt great, right? About 3 months later, the Crohn's erupted into this huge flare, and I ended up losing another 20 pounds. They tried Stelara for 8 weeks. It didn't work. They finally put me on something called Remicade, which you have to get in an infusion every 2 months, and that has really done a lot for me. It really kind of normalized my life. Now, having Crohn's or colitis can be a real challenge, because Crohn's basically is from your lips to your butt. Anywhere along that digestive canal or digestive pathway, you can have a problem. For instance, for about 6 months, my tongue was swollen and painful. I mean, my tongue hurt. I didn't want to eat anything because it hurt so much. And sometimes it reacted more to heavily spicy or savory foods. But regardless, it was really swollen and painful, and it made me have problems talking. I had to clearly enunciate a lot of my words. Occasionally I would find myself drooling while I was eating because my tongue was wide and I wasn't able to keep everything where it was supposed to be. Additionally, I do get the occasional weird skin issue, like a weird discoloration or rash or something like that. Now, most of that is dissipated with time, but you just know what surprises Crohn's has in for you. Some of the other weird side effects I get is I'll get cracking in the corners of my mouth, which can be very painful, and I have found some really good ointment to use on that when it happens. The problem with Crohn's is you can get all kinds of weird things going on with your body, and you don't really have a whole lot of control over it. And for me personally, I watch my diet. I try and get a lot of rest. And that is the problem. People with Crohn's disease, we are very productive. However, the disease can knock you out. So for me personally, when I'm feeling good, I try and get a lot of stuff done because I know there will be a counterweight to that, whether it's the next day or 2 days. I will not feel good. I will feel really tired and exhausted, at which point I just have to kind of slow down, take naps, just relax as much as you can. That's one reason I use a lot of cannabis. I hope this hasn't been too boring for you. It's kind of a story that I've wanted to share with people, but for various reasons, I've held back. Just know that if someone has a chronic disease like Crohn's, colitis, diabetes, anything like that, just because the person doesn't look ill doesn't mean that they're not. I'm not fishing for sympathy here. It's just something a lot of people in the world have to deal with. I personally worry about the effects of these biologics. What's going to happen in 20 years? All of our immune systems are compromised. And if you get another pandemic or similar, how is that going to affect the folks who've been taking these medications? Remicade gets billed to the insurance companies at about $18,000 per dosage. I get 6 of those a year. It's a lot of money. I really hope you've gotten some good information, some ideas, some understanding of what Crohn's or colitis is about. There are a lot of support groups devoted to people who suffer from inflammatory bowel disease, including but not limited to Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. So I would urge you to check them out if you're having any kind of issues kind of adjusting to the situation, or if you need help or shoulder to cry on. They're well worth it. Check them out. Please leave comments down below. If you've got a story to tell, please tell us in the comments down below. Or if you want to get more personal, please reach out to me at jaysbeard.com. Check out the channel. We love you. Stay lifted, stay well groomed, stay healthy. Cheers.